every morning for 23 years. I was the first one inside Rivergate Plaza. The security guard barely looked up anymore when I swiped in at 6:30 sharp. By then, the building already felt like an extension of my own body, every hum of a vent, every flicker of a light. Every complaint buried in its walls was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I had been the chief building engineer at Asterion Technologies since the days when the company was nothing more than a handful of dreamers renting a single floor above a pawn shop. Back then, our office furniture was mismatched, our servers overheated if someone so much as printed a document, and the coffee pots sputtered more dust than caffeine. But we survived, and I kept everything running. As the years stacked up, the company grew taller and sleeker, but my role never really changed. I became the invisible spine holding it all together. When the power grid overloaded, I was the one knee-deep in breaker panels at midnight. When pipes burst in the middle of a Dallas freeze, I was the one with a wrench in my frozen hands before the executives even noticed the water damage. When the server room nearly drowned during a 2009 storm, it was me who rigged a temporary drainage line with duct tape and sheer determination. Those emergencies passed, the company kept climbing, and nobody ever asked who had kept their empire breathing. If you're watching right now, take a second to gently rub your palms together until they feel warm. Then place them lightly over your eyes. Now I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. If this story resonates with you, tap the like button and subscribe. It makes sure you won't miss the next story. Recognition never came. Not even once. The best I ever got was from an old vice president who tossed me half of a protein bar after I restored power during an ice storm. "You're a saint, Gloria," he mumbled, not even bothering to say my name correctly. That was the moment I realized the truth to them. I was a fixture, no more noticeable than the elevator that opened when they pressed the button. I kept their world running in silence, because silence was expected. Still, I stayed. I told myself loyalty meant something, that good work eventually spoke louder than titles or bonuses. And every morning, when I turned the brass key I'd carried since 2001, I believed naively that unlocking those doors was unlocking a future we were building together. What kept me going wasn't the pay or the praise, because there was never much of either. What kept me going was if I didn't show up, the building itself would fall apart. Every day, I handled the things no one else even thought about. If the air conditioning cut out during a board meeting in August, I was the one crawling through ducts with sweat dripping into my eyes. If the restroom on the 12th floor flooded right before an investor visit, I was the one mopping it up at dawn so no one would see the mess. If the power grid flickered when every cubicle plugged in their brand new monitors, I was the one pulling double shifts with a flashlight in one hand and a breaker diagram in the other. I kept everything running because that's what I had always done. And yet, none of it was visible. The executives upstairs never saw the hours I spent cleaning mold out of air vents to keep their wellness culture intact. They never noticed the gallons of water I drained from the roof after a storm so their designer lobby wouldn't smell like mildew. They didn't know that I kept a handwritten binder with every shortcut a contractor had ever taken, because sooner or later, those shortcuts turned into failures. And when those failures came, I was the one patching them before anyone in a suit even noticed. The strange thing about being indispensable is how quickly it turns into invisibility. At Asterion, if I did my job perfectly, nobody remembered I existed. No one thanked me when their computers stayed online because I'd spent all night replacing a fried circuit board. No one stopped me in the hall to say they appreciated the fact that the elevators still ran smoothly after 20 years of overuse. My reward for excellence was silence. My punishment for one missed call would have been hell. That was the balance. And still, I convinced myself it was worth it. I told myself that loyalty would mean something in the long run. That all the mornings I scraped half-rotten sushi out of the break room fridge, all the weekends I spent tightening bolts in boiler rooms, all the times I went home reeking of rust and chemical cleaners, it would add up to respect one day. I believed that, because I had to. It was the only way to keep showing up. But every year that passed, It became clearer I wasn't part of the story they told about themselves. When the CEO stood at town halls bragging about innovation, he never once mentioned the people keeping the lights on. When HR sent out glossy newsletters celebrating culture, my name was never in them. I was the wall they leaned against while they posed for photographs. A wall doesn't get applause. It just carries the weight in silence, and that silence was starting to feel unbearable. I didn't begin this job with bitterness in my veins. Back then, I was proud, almost naive, believing that loyalty and hard work could carve out a place no one could take from me. My father's voice still echoed when I first walked into Rivergate Plaza in 2001. He was a carpenter who believed in tools, not titles, when I was 19. He handed me his battered Craftsman toolbox, its red metal chipped from decades of use, and told me, "You do the work right, or you don't do it at all." That toolbox has sat in my garage ever since, socket wrenches still lined up exactly as he left them. To me, it's worth more than any plaque they never gave me, or any bonus they never thought to offer. That toolbox was what I carried, in spirit. The day Randy Ellis, founder of Asterion, begged me to help secure our first office, the company had 5 employees, no credit history, and dreams bigger than their bank balance. The landlord wouldn't even return their calls. I still remember Randy sweating into his coffee at the diner, whispering Gloria, "If you don't co-sign this lease, we'll be back in my garage tomorrow. My wife will kill me." I didn't just co-sign, I signed the entire thing. The lease went into my name because no one else could carry it. Randy promised it was temporary, just until the company found its footing. He swore it would be transferred later. I trusted him, and like so many promises made in desperation, it was forgotten. Years rolled by. CEOs rotated. Departments multiplied. IPO rumors came and went, yet through every renewal, my name stayed on that lease. I dealt with the property manager when the air conditioning failed. I approved carpet replacements, pest control, even patched leaks when squirrels died in the insulation above Suite 502. Nobody asked questions. Nobody cared. As long as the building ran, it didn't matter whose name was on the paperwork. At first, I didn't mind. The company still felt like family then. We split cheap pizza after late nights, passed around sheet cakes for birthdays, and believed we were building something together. But families forget. They forget who fixed the plumbing on Christmas Eve. They forget who scrubbed mildew off lobby tiles so clients wouldn't wrinkle their noses. They forget who held the walls together while they stacked floor after floor of ambition on top. It was only years later, staring at that lease tucked inside my father's toolbox, that I saw the irony. 2 decades of invisibility. They called me maintenance, confused my name, treated me as replaceable, yet the one thing holding their empire upright, the roof over their heads, still rested quietly in mine. And that, more than anything, was the seed of my anger. The first crack in the facade didn't come from a broken pipe or a flickering light. It came in the form of an email. It was a Monday afternoon, one of those long days when I was already on a ladder, replacing a burned-out ballast in the conference room. My phone buzzed, and there it was, an all-staff message from HR. The subject line read, "Strategic Realignment Opportunities." I froze. I'd been around long enough to know what that corporate poetry meant. It was the same sterile phrase they'd used in 2008 when they gutted half the accounting department. The same line they fed the IT guys in 2016, right before they outsourced half the team to a firm overseas. Strategic realignment was just code for someone's about to lose their job. The email was loaded with hollow phrases positioning for growth, modernizing our operations, redefining our culture for the future. It might as well have been a funeral notice, and as I read it, my gut went cold. I'd sat in enough of those meetings, watched enough good people walk out with cardboard boxes, to know the script, first the email, then the calendar invite, then the closed-door conversation where they told you it wasn't personal. And sure enough, at 4:58 p.m., while I was still on that ladder, with a screwdriver in my hand, the invite popped up. Quick sync with HR, Conference Room B, Tuesday, 9:00 a.m. No explanation, no context, just a digital summons dropped on my calendar like a guillotine blade. I climbed down the ladder slowly, almost mechanically, and stared at the screen. I didn't need anyone to spell it out. After 23 years, they had finally decided I was expendable. That night, I barely touched my dinner. I sat at my kitchen table with the severed light ballast still rattling in my truck outside. And I thought about all the faces I'd seen in those HR meetings over the years. Some cried, some begged, some tried to negotiate, and almost all of them left broken. Carrying their last paycheck in a thin white envelope, I had been the one to cover their shifts after they were gone, to keep the building running while everyone else pretended nothing had happened. And now it was my turn. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. But I did something I hadn't done in years. I started remembering. Remembering the lease. Remembering the promises that had been left to rot. Remembering that my name wasn't just on the maintenance logs, it was on the legal paperwork that kept Asterion under a roof. The meeting was less than 12 hours away. The execution was scheduled. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought burned hotter than the rest. They thought I was powerless. They thought I'd show up, take my severance, hand over my keys, and disappear. They had no idea what they'd forgotten. What do you think happens when someone like me walks into that HR meeting? Do they walk me out quietly? Or do I walk out with something they never saw coming? Stay with me until the end of this story. You won't want to miss what happens next. The next morning, I didn't dress for defeat. I dressed for war. At 8:45 sharp, I walked into Rivergate Plaza wearing my denim work shirt with the company's faded logo stitched on the chest. The same shirt I'd worn since 2004. My boots were polished, scuffed from decades of work, but solid, like armor. If they were going to erase me, they'd do it while looking straight at the proof of who had carried this building for 23 years. Conference Room B smelled like fresh printer ink and stale coffee. Inside, Lance Morton, the HR boy wonder, was already waiting. He had that practiced grin on his face, the kind you see on guidance counselors before they expel a student. Next to him sat Jared Klein, a lawyer I'd never met before. Slick hair, designer shoes. He stroked the folder in front of him as if it contained nuclear codes. "Gloria, thanks for coming in," Lance chirped. His tone was too high, too rehearsed. I knew the playbook. First, the smile, then the folder, then the apology that wasn't really an apology. I sat down slowly, folding my hands on the table. "Let's get this over with." Lance cleared his throat. "As you know, Asterion is moving in a new direction. We're modernizing operations, and I cut him off. And that direction doesn't include me." "Right." He froze. Jared glanced down at the folder, then slid it across the table. Inside was a severance package, 3 months' pay, health insurance until the end of the quarter, and an NDA clause thicker than a phone book. Generous. They probably thought, to me, it was an insult wrapped in legal jargon. I flipped through the papers and stopped cold. My name was spelled wrong. Gloris Dean. 23 years. And they couldn't even spell the name of the woman who had unlocked this building every single morning. "Is this a joke?" I asked. My voice low. Jared didn't flinch. "We're asking for your badge and keys today. Also, any company property in your possession." For a moment, the room went silent. I reached into my bag and pulled out the badge. I set it on the table like a poker chip tossed into the pot. Then I took out the key ring, 17 keys, each labeled in my handwriting from when I personally rekeyed the entire building in 2005. The metal clanged against the wood. "You sure you want these?" I asked, locking eyes with Lance. "Last chance to think this through?" He blinked. Gave me that HR face, sympathetic, professional, and fake as margarine. "It's not personal." "Gloria." "Not personal." I leaned forward. "You just fired the only person in this building who knows where the main water shutoff is. Good luck with that." I stood, buttoned my shirt, and gathered the sad little folder. The meeting was over. They thought they'd closed my story, but all they'd done was set the stage for theirs to collapse. Walking out of that conference room, I felt the weight of the keyring leave my hand, but not my memory. Those 17 keys weren't just pieces of metal. They were years of sweat and scars, each one tied to a night I stayed late, or an emergency I solved while everyone else slept. Handing them over should have been symbolic, a warning that the building was now without its backbone. But of course, they didn't see it that way. I gave them one last chance, one final lifeline before they drowned in their own arrogance. Standing at the door, folder tucked under my arm, I turned back and looked Lance straight in the eye. You just fired the only person in this company who knows where the main water shutoff is. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a second, his smile faltered. For a second, I thought he might actually realize what he'd done. But then the fake grin slid back into place, polished and hollow. "We'll be fine," he said. Fine. That was the word they always used before the next crisis. When the server overheated, they said it would be fine until it wasn't. When the pipes burst in the Dallas freeze, they told investors it was fine while I was downstairs in ankle-deep water fighting to save their data center. Fine was their shield, their excuse, their lie. And now they thought losing me was going to be fine. I walked through the lobby with my head high, but inside I was burning. For 23 years. I had put out fires literally and figuratively, and in return, they dismissed me with a severance check that couldn't cover half a year's mortgage and a misspelled name. The insult wasn't just personal, it was dangerous. They had no idea how fragile their empire really was. By the time I reached the sidewalk, the sun was blinding, too bright for the fury churning in my chest. People passed by with coffees and laptops, oblivious to the fact that the building behind me had just signed its own death warrant, because that's what it was the moment I handed over those keys. They severed themselves from the one person who understood the skeleton of that place. And I knew, with the certainty of someone who's seen too many systems fail, that it was only a matter of time before the cracks showed. But here's the truth, I didn't feel guilty for walking away. Not then, not ever. I had warned them. I had given them the chance to pause, to think, to listen. They ignored it. They looked at me and saw a relic, someone too old-fashioned for their shiny new culture. They didn't see the woman who had held the walls upright while they played at being visionaries. As I reached my truck and tossed the severance folder onto the passenger seat, I realized something. For 23 years, I had been the quiet solution to their chaos. Now, for the first time, I was about to become the cause. I didn't drive straight home that morning. Instead, I pulled into a coffee shop parking lot, killed the engine, and sat there with the severance folder staring up at me from the passenger seat. The papers inside were worthless, but they triggered something I hadn't thought about in years. The lease. My lease, for most people. A lease is a dull piece of paperwork you sign once and forget. For me, it was a lifeline, a document I'd carried on my back for 23 years, without anyone even noticing. When Asterion was just a startup of desperate dreamers, I'd been the one to put my name on the dotted line, because no landlord wanted to gamble on a company that barely had 5 employees and no credit history. Back then, it was supposed to be temporary. The founder promised me the company would take it over once they stabilized. But promises fade, and time buries details under years of routine. And so, the building's official leaseholder remained me, Gloria Dean. That fact had slipped into the background of my life, every few years. When the renewal paperwork came, I filed it away neatly in the top drawer of my father's old Craftsman toolbox, the same one he gave me when I was 19. Alongside socket wrenches and old screws sat documents that no one in Asterion ever bothered to ask about. They just assumed the company owned the space they worked in. They assumed wrong, sitting in that parking lot. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through emails. Nothing from the property manager, no reminders, no signed forms. I opened my files and checked the last renewal notice. Section 9B, renewal of lease term, shall require written notice from lessee no later than 30 days prior to expiration. The expiration date, August 1st. I checked the calendar. It was August 3rd. 2 days passed. No notice, no renewal, nothing. I let out a slow laugh that startled even me. After everything, after all the dismissals and the arrogance, they had forgotten the single most important detail of their existence, the right to stay in the building they called their empire. They had been so busy polishing investor decks and spouting buzzwords about culture that they overlooked the foundation beneath their feet. And here was the irony: the woman they had just discarded like a used air filter was still the legal tenant of the building. With their silence, the lease had defaulted to a month-to-month agreement, one that either party could terminate with 30 days' notice, which meant, with a single signature, I could end their claim to Rivergate Plaza. I sat back against the seat, the fury in my chest cooling into something sharper. This wasn't vengeance. This was math. This was law. They had erased me. But in their arrogance, they had erased their own footing first, for the first time in weeks, maybe months. I smiled. Not a warm smile, a dangerous one. Because now, I wasn't powerless. I was holding the one thing they couldn't replace. Once the realization sank in, I didn't waste time. I drove straight home, pulled into my garage, and carried the old Craftsman toolbox to the workbench like I'd done 1,000 times before. Only this time, I wasn't reaching for a wrench. I pulled out the folder tucked beneath the socket set, coffee-stained, stapled too many times, its corners bent from years of being shoved back into place. The original lease, all 7 amendments, every scrap of paper that proved the building didn't belong to Asterion, it belonged to me. I spread the documents across the bench, tracing my finger down the fine print. Section 9B glared up at me like a weapon that had been hiding in plain sight. They'd missed the deadline. The contract was vulnerable, and now, so were they. But I wasn't reckless. I knew the difference between anger and strategy. So I called the one person I trusted with this kind of move, Leo Bishop, an attorney I'd known since he was a kid mowing lawns on my street. Now he wore a Bluetooth headset and lived in the world of arbitration and real estate law. He answered on the second ring. "Gloria, you okay, no?" I said flatly. "But it's about to get very interesting. Do you remember the lease I signed back in 2001? There was a pause, followed by a low whistle. "You still have that, every page." Within hours, Leo was at my house. We sat at the workbench like 2 conspirators, reviewing the terms line by line. His eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. "They didn't renew." He muttered, "This means you're still the legal tenant. You can terminate at any time." I leaned back in my chair. Exactly. And I already know who's taking their spot. 6 months earlier, I'd had a casual conversation at the farmer's market with Marina Cole, founder of a wellness startup called Everwell. She'd been desperate for downtown space, hinting she'd pay triple the market rate for the right location. At the time, it was idle talk. Now, it was destiny. By the end of the day, Leo had drafted a formal notice of termination on thick letterhead that smelled of ink and finality. All it needed was my signature. I signed with a steady hand, pressing hard enough to leave an imprint through the page. As I slid the envelope across the desk toward him, I felt 23 years of silence shifting into something else. Not revenge, not spite, something colder, control. For the first time in decades, the power wasn't theirs. It was mine. The notice went out on a Thursday morning. Certified mail, email, even a PDF copy sent directly to the property manager's office. Leo didn't leave a single crack they could wiggle through. By 9:15 a.m., the receptionist at Asterion signed for the envelope without a second glance. She was a temp, probably thought it was another stack of vendor invoices, and dropped it into the bin between expired protein bars and a broken laminator. That small oversight bought them a few hours of blissful ignorance. But ignorance never lasts. By 8:04 the following Monday, the illusion shattered. Employees streamed through the lobby, oat milk lattes in hand, only to freeze at the sight taped to the glass doors, a fluorescent orange, notice to vacate zip-tied to the CEO's office. It was impossible to ignore thick legal font, bold dates, my name in capital letters at the top, plaintiff, Gloria Dean. The reaction was instant. HR's golden boy, Lance Morton, went pale. He yanked at the notice like it was a prank, only to find it laminated and bolted to the handle. He pulled out his phone, fumbling to call legal, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. By the time Ethan Ward, the CEO, arrived 15 minutes later, the damage was done. A crowd of employees stood clustered in the hallway, whispering, watching, recording. Ethan stormed down the corridor, unshaven, Bluetooth still wedged in his ear, probably expecting another crushing it kind of morning. Instead, he found Lance pacing like a man on the edge of collapse, holding the eviction notice like a death certificate. Ethan tore it out of his hands, read it once, then again, his face draining of color with each line. Impossible. He muttered, "We own this lease." Wrong. They assumed, just like they assumed I was disposable. By 9:02, his phone rang. It was Thomas Weber. "The property manager, Mr. Ward," Thomas said evenly. "We are enforcing the lease termination effective 30 days. We notified you via certified mail and email. You failed to respond. The premises will be vacated. The new tenant has already secured occupancy." Ethan's voice cracked. "What new tenant? That is not your concern anymore." By mid-morning, the panic spread like fire. Investor calls flooded in. Marketing tried to spin the story as a strategic relocation, printing paper signs and taping them to boxes, but the truth leaked faster than they could patch it. By lunchtime, half the staff had seen the eviction order online. Someone had snapped a photo and posted it on LinkedIn with the caption, "This is what happens when you forget who built the foundation." And that was the heart of it, for years. They'd ignored me, dismissed me, erased me. But my name misspelled on a severance letter was suddenly burned into every headline, every whisper, every investor call. They wanted me redundant. Instead, I became unforgettable. 3 months later, Rivergate Plaza didn't look anything like the place I had unlocked every morning for 23 years. The glass doors that once framed Asterian's logo now gleamed with a new sign, Everwell Wellness. The lobby smelled of lavender diffusers, where there used to be cubicles crammed with tired engineers. There were now quiet meditation pods and sleek furniture, for the first time in decades. The building seemed alive in a way it never had under Asterian's watch. I wasn't bitter walking through those doors. I didn't need to be. The eviction had been carried out cleanly, the transition swift. Employees who once passed me in hallways without eye contact had scattered, many to better jobs, some to companies that still valued experience. And me, I had finally stepped into a life that wasn't chained to their crises. Consulting had found me quickly, within weeks of the eviction going public. Property managers and building owners began calling my phone, all of them wanting someone who actually knew how to keep a place standing. My reputation, once invisible, was suddenly currency. I signed contracts with 4 buildings downtown, doubled my income, and set my own hours for the first time in my adult life. More importantly, I chose where I put my energy and who deserved it. That night, in my garage, I stood in front of the pegboard where my father's photo still hung. Next to it was my first paycheck from 1981, yellowed but intact. With a steady hand, I mounted a small brass hook. From my pocket, I pulled out the original brass key to Rivergate Plaza, the one I had carried since 2001. I hung it there like a trophy, not as a reminder of what they had taken, but as proof of what I had built and what I had reclaimed. For years, they thought I was invisible, redundant, replaceable. But the truth was simpler. I had always been the load-bearing wall. And when a wall like that walks away, the whole building comes down, sometimes. Justice doesn't roar. It stands steady until the other side collapses under its own arrogance. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments what part hit you the hardest. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Your voice keeps these stories alive.